My name's Jim McLaughlin. I'm a national chess master. I've been playing chess for 50 years. Tonight we're continuing our sessions on chess tactics. All these examples are taken from the book The Game of Chess by Siegbert Tarrasch, published in the United States in 1935. Tonight's topic is destruction of a guard. So we previously covered pinning and double attacks and unguarded pieces. Okay, our first example, white to play and win. Now remember, it's destruction of a guard. So we see that the white queen is attacking the black queen. The black queen is protected by the king. The white queen is also attacking the black bishop, but that black bishop is protected by both king and queen. So it's likely not the bishop that's the target of the combination. Who would like to propose a solution? Just go ahead and speak up. I have a hard time seeing you. Rook to h8, yes. The bishop's pinned. It draws the king away from the queen, allowing queen takes queen. So this is a simple example, but it gives the basic idea. All the examples tonight will be taking away the guard of some important piece. This example, you can build on what we did last example. It's pretty straightforward. Who sees the winning move for white? Right, it gets right back into the variation we just looked at. So the bishop takes the pawn, the queen takes, and then again the rook draws the king away. This is another fairly simple example. The thing to look for, in this case black wins. How can black destroy one piece that's guarding another? Who would like to propose the solution? Do you see it? No? Okay, let's analyze it just a little bit. Both the rooks, the black rooks, one is attacking the bishop, one is attacking the knight. Now the bishop's protected by a pawn. The pawn's not being attacked, so you can't draw the protection away from the bishop. That leaves the knight. What's protecting the knight? The bishop. Can black destroy the bishop? And that's the answer. So the answer is rook takes e3, pawn takes, and then the knight's unprotected, rook takes knight, and you win two pieces for a rook. And you're left with a winning game. I think. Yeah, you're left with a winning game. But anyway, it's not so much to win the game as to get the point of destroying the guard, which is the bishop at e3. Oh, this is real simple. Well, it's got a little twist at the end, but you can see in analyzing the position that the white queen is unprotected. That's always the danger. You will also notice that the black queen is on the line with the white queen, but there is a rook in the way. So this is pretty straightforward. Who would like to propose a solution here? Jason?
Black's move, right?
Yep.
Okay, rook d1.
Where?
No, wait a minute.
Rook d1, queen takes rook.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Rook takes g3.
Yeah, you're right. Rook to g3, check. White has to protect the queen. Now what's the move? Similar to our first example. You need to draw the white king away from the queen again. So what move will do that? The answer is rook to g1 check. The king takes the rook, leaving the queen unprotected, just kind of like our first two examples. Okay. Both sides have 3 pawns. Both sides have a rook and 2 pieces. Okay, let's look at what's attacking what. The black knight is obviously attacking the b2 pawn and the a3 pawn. Behind the black knight, the rook is attacking, once the knight moves, would be attacking the knight at c3. Now, remember, we want to either destroy the guard itself or make it move somewhere else. Now, in this case, the pawn at b2 is trying to protect 2 different squares, a3 and c3. That is overworking that little pawn, and that leads us to the correct move for black. Who sees the winning move for black? Julian?
Knight to A3.
Right, knight to a3, and pawn takes knight, and then the knight is free. So we drew the protecting pawn from b2 to a3, allowing rook takes knight, and obviously even here the a3 pawn's in trouble, and black has 2 pawns on the queen side versus 1, so it should be an easy win for black. All right. I don't remember the solution, but it looks like black has the winning chances. The black has a rook for a bishop, and he has his rook and queen are in a strong attacking position. The white's king stuck in the corner. So I think it's pretty simple. Similar to what we already saw in the first 2 examples. So who would care to propose a solution here? Do you see it? Black to move and win. What's the strongest black queen move? Can the black queen attack the king? And what square would that be? So the black queen can check the king on e5, so that's the move. Queen to e5 check. The king can't retreat, so the queen has to interpose herself, right? Now we have the old thing of the drawing the king away from the queen, so the winning move is now rook to h1 check. He has to try king to g2, but it doesn't do any good because we have rook to g1 check. King takes, queen check. White has 6 pawns, black has 4. White has a queen on d4. Notice that it's on the same line as the white king. But we can't play bishop to c5, pinning the queen, because the knight on a4 guards c5. Now the white rook is on f3. Notice that the white's first rank is unprotected by a rook, queen, or any piece, so that e1 square is open. Further, notice that the black bishop not only has the potential bishop to c5 if the knight wasn't there, but the bishop can attack on the king side to the h2 pawn. It's attacking the h2 pawn. The black rook is not helping black in this case because it's hiding behind its queen rook pawn, so the black rook is out of it. That pretty much means whatever we're going to do has to be done with the queen and bishop. Would anyone care to propose the winning move for black? Okay, well, I will. Queen to e1 check. forces the rook to retreat, and bishop takes pawn check, drawing the king, in this case, away from the rook. Queen takes rook, we won a pawn in an exchange. Let's analyze this position a little bit. White has a queen on d4, attacking the black knight and defending the pawn. The queen, again, is on the same line with the black king. Once again, there's a white knight on queen rook 4, though, preventing the move bishop to c5, pinning the queen to the king. Both rooks look like they're developed in a similar fashion. The white rook is on e1 and f1, and black is on e8 and f8. Difference being that the white rook on f1 is attacking the pawn on f5, which is only defended by the rook, so if it was white's move, he could win a pawn with rook takes pawn or bishop takes pawn. Of course, we want more than that. I have a sneaking suspicion black wins. The example starts out with white making a blunder. So we have to make the blunder first. Bishop takes f5, question mark. That makes things much easier for us. Now let's look at it a little bit more. Number one, the rook on e1 looks like it's pinning our knight. It's only protected by the white rook on f1. And notice, of course, you notice that the knight can jump to f3 with check, breaking the pin and attacking the white queen. So since our topic is distracting or destroying the guard, in this case, the guard is the rook on f1. So how can we move the guard from f1 somewhere else? And the answer is pretty obvious at this point. Rook takes f5, winning a piece. If rook takes rook, then we have we do our knight check. Rook takes knight, queen takes, and lo and behold, we can get the same position that we just looked at it a minute ago and draw the king away. But this is better position. Remember when we looked at this position earlier, the black rook was on queen rook 8 or a8. Now it's on e8, makes our attack a little stronger, I guess. Okay, let's see what we have here. Black's queen and rook look like they are deep into white's territory. The black queen is on c2, the rook on e7. They're attacking the knight, and the queen is attacking the bishop, isn't it? So we're attacking two pieces. Unfortunately for white, one piece is defending both the knight and the bishop. Again, this is not just distracting the guard, but it's also an example of an overworked defensive piece. The white rook on f1 is overworked in that it's trying to defend both the knight and bishop. So I think that makes the answer pretty clear. It must be rook takes knight. Rook takes rook, queen takes bishop check. And it is. Now notice that if the rook retreats and attacks the queen, that won't cut it because we have bishop to d4 check, forcing the king away, and then we have queen takes rook. So the only move is queen to h7, but the analysis stops. So that was our example for distracting and the guard, and we won. We have two pieces for a rook. And with the clearly, probably, well, I'd like to say it's clearly winning. It probably is the two bishops. So I think black probably wins that pretty easy. Okay, this one is really simple. The white queen is attacking the black queen on d5. The black queen is defended by the rook. Conveniently for white, the black king is in the corner on h8. And also conveniently for white, white has a rook on f1. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. Who would like to propose the solution to this problem? Well, I'll go ahead and propose it. I know some of you see it. The winning move is rook to f8 check. If rook takes rook, obviously queen takes queen. So the only move is the king to move up. Now we can our rook on f8 is attacking both rooks. Notice that. All we have to do is draw the rook on d8 away from protecting the rook on a8, and we win a rook. So queen takes queen, rook takes rook, rook takes rook. Let's analyze this position a little bit. The most obvious defect in black's position, he has double pawns. He has the pawn on c6. Double pawns are weak. In this case, it is protected by the queen. Another defect in black's position is his black squared bishop has no squares to move outward. He can only retreat to f8. And if he retreated to f8, notice he would leave his knight underprotected, and white could do bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and those double pawns are even worse than the ones on the queen side, the pawn on f6 and f7. Plus, with the white knight hovering about f5 or h5, white would have a winning advantage after bishop to f8, bishop takes knight. So that strikes us. Black center pawns aren't all that bad. The three little pawns on the queen side, c7, c6, and d6, as long as they're together like that, they cover lots of center squares. The pawn on c7 protects the d6 pawn. So black's pawn position per se in the center isn't that bad. White's better, of course, because white doesn't have a double pawn. He's got a pawn on d3 protecting his e4 pawn. Knight on g3 protects the e4 pawn. The rook protects the pawn. And white's bishop is obviously superior to black's. White's bishop is on the long diagonal, hitting the knight on f6 and the pawn behind it. So white has a clear advantage. I remember this one. So I can tell you for a fact that the author is up to his old trick. He makes a blunder for black. Then our winning move will become much clearer. So black plays the very bad d5, question mark. That allows us, if we want to, we can advance our pawn and drive the knight away from its protective square. So let's say we do that. Where can the knight go to? He can't go to h5, that's covered by our queen and knight. And he can't go to e4, that's covered by our d3 pawn. He can't retreat because all the white squares are covered by his pieces and pawns. Queen on d7, rook on e8, pawn on h7. Looks to me like the only square he can move to is knight to g4. Of course, our queen hits the g4 square, but it is protected by his queen. We could hit the knight with the h pawn and drive it back. Could go back to knight to h6. It might be not a good square for it, but it wouldn't be lost anyway. But let's rewind it. We do pawn up, knight to g4. Remember, we want to break the guard. The guard is the queen. What's the winning move to break the connection between the black queen and the black knight on g4? Julian. E6. The pawn threatens the queen and is protected by the rook, so the queen can't take it. The pawn on f7 takes it. That breaks the connection to the queen and knight, and then queen takes knight wins the piece. So that worked rather well. Nice win for white. Okay. Our last example for destruction of a guard. Let's see what we have here. It's kind of a messy position to me. Let's start with white. White's queen and bishop are attacking the pawn on h6, but they're defended adequately by the queen on f8, the bishop on g7. It could be. I don't remember. It may come to me. But let's run through white and then we'll run through black. Now, the white knight doesn't appear to be attacking anything. It's way back on e2, so it's not doing anything. It's not even defending any good squares except for d4. The white rooks, well, the rook on d1's not bad with the queen. They threaten queen takes pawn on d6. I guess you'd have to say that's white's only threat. The white king rook is inactive. And obviously the white king is exposed on c2, not to mention the fact his pawn on b3 is attacked by the black pawn on c4. So white's in trouble. So I'm going to have to go with Julian. Black must win this. Now, black's most obvious move, I always tend to look at checks first. So pawn takes pawn check. Looks like we would have to do rook pawn takes. Then what? Oh, c4. Very good. c4 attacking the pawn on b3, and if the pawn on b3 takes c4, it opens the line for the black rook on b8 to take the pawn on b2. I think you just solved it. Let's see. Oh, it was white's move. That makes a difference. Queen takes pawn. I still go with your line, though. Nope. Oh, look. Now, the queen and rook, the rook protects the... Oh, and it's a check, isn't it? Okay, so the author had white make a blunder again. That's at least a question mark. That's probably a double question mark move. Because knight up check breaks the rook protecting the queen. Has to do rook takes, then pawn takes. And the queen is still, okay. Well, anyway, that's the end of the example. So I had a sneaking suspicion that we might run out of examples on this topic. So I prepared another topic. The next topic in the book, and we'll jump right into it, is called illusory protection. And quite simply, that just means it looks like a piece is protected by, say, a pawn, but it's not an effective protection. Maybe the pawn is pinned against a king or a queen or a rook, so you take the piece anyway and the queen takes back, and then, well, if it's a king, the pawn can't move, so it's no protection at all. If it's a queen or rook, the pawn takes and you win the piece behind the pawn. So that's the basic idea. Let's run through a couple examples. It's black's move. Now, white's king is stuck in the center. You see, he moved his king to d1 at some point, and he can't castle. That's very bad. The black knight is in a nice attacking position on d5, protected by the bishop and the pawn. White does have his bishop and knight developed, and if he could make a few moves, he might get his knight to c4 or e4 and actually do something. But he has a longer term problem in how does he get his queen rook into play? He's got to move his king somewhere and then move the rook into play. Maybe he should move his king over to e1 and try to get his rook to d1. Maybe that would be reasonable. But it's black's move. Let's look at black's attacking moves. The black knight has an attacking move. I wouldn't play it yet, though, because the knight is well posted right on d5, but maybe it'll come in the future. He can play knight to f4, attacking the queen and the g2 pawn, and it also opens up the line for the black white squared bishop to come down into white's position. I don't see any I don't see any good attacking moves for the black bishop on e6. If he moves that bishop, white could trade queens. I'm sure white would love to trade queens and at least get to an ending. Obviously, black's pawns are not in contact with white's pawns or pieces, so they have nothing to do with it. That leaves the black rook. It's inactive behind the a pawn, so the most obvious piece to move to the attack is the rook. Where should black move his rook? Julian?
Black should play rook b8.
Right. Now, he attacks the pawn on b2. We don't have the, we're getting to where we're going to have a guard that can be distracted. Oh, one other thing that I forgot to point out. Notice that the knight on d5 can hit c3 with check, and the king and queen are very conveniently lined up for a knight fork. So a blunder for white, which is in the author's example, he has a couple blunders. Rook to b8, b1, that doesn't cut it, does it? Because now we destroy the guard of c3, which is the pawn on b2, preventing the knight check with rook takes pawn, temporary rook sacrifice, rook takes rook, knight to c3 check, wins. Similarly, another way to protect the b2 pawn would be, let me call up my notation here. The other possible bad defense is knight to c4. And again, rook takes pawn does the same thing. The difference being the knight moves better than the rook move, because when the rook move, rook takes pawn threatens rook takes rook check and the knight fork. Now we just threaten the knight fork, and so he can move his king and at least avoid losing the queen. But he lost a key pawn. Now, another way, there was a better way to defend the pawn. There's two other ways to defend the pawn on b2. The pawn on b2 is a black square. White has a black squared bishop. So it could move to d4 and protect the pawn. Similarly, the king is one square away, and it could move to c1 and protect the pawn. So bishop to d4, that the author points out that you don't only have to look at protecting the pawn, you have to think about protecting the function the pawn had. The pawn's key function was to defend the c3 square. That's why the rook and knight don't work, because they don't operate on a diagonal like the pawn. But the bishop works, because the bishop works on the diagonal, and obviously rook takes pawn, bishop takes, guards the c3 square. Black still has a big advantage positionally, but that's not the point of this exercise. And finally, black could try king to c1. And of course, the king can move on a diagonal. So if rook takes, king takes, the king guards c3. So the king would replace the function of the b2 pawn. But the computer really hates king to c1. It says black is winning the game, whereas with the bishop move or the knight move, black merely has the much better game. So this is a little bit of a sideline. Who could say why king to c1 is a losing position for white? There's no immediate combinations. It's a positional sort of thing. Julian. Yeah, that's a good point. The other thing is, remember I said white's biggest problem is getting his queen rook into play on a1. King to c1 actually makes it harder, because now the white rook only can go to b1 or back to a1. And the other thing worth the note is that to the right of the king, all those back row squares are open. And it's possible that black could come up, like Julian said, queen f8 to b4 and a4. That looks very strong. Black could also play with moving queen to h5 and dropping it down to h1 check. But it looks like white has a defense to that by dropping his queen back. So I think I'll go with Julian's attacking idea as the best idea. Okay. Again, this topic is illusory protection. I'm going to have to say, I believe black is the attacker here. Notice that black's bishop on f6 comes down to c3 and attacks the pawn on b2 and attacks the knight on c3. So the pawn on b2 protects the knight. If we can get rid of that pawn, the knight's unprotected. I think just like the other example, black moves his rook to b8, attacking the pawn. And if rook takes, notice how convenient this works out. Rook takes pawn, bishop takes, and the bishop conveniently attacks two rooks, getting the exchange back and having won a pawn. So that's pretty straightforward. Well, this is very simple. Notice that the two white rooks are attacking the two black knights. The black knights are defended by one pawn. Well, remember we talked about an overworked defensive piece. Well, that pawn is the perfect example. The best way to take for white is rook takes c6. The computer says rook takes e6 gives a big advantage, but rook takes c6 is winning, outright winning. Pawn takes, rook takes. Now I think the reason why taking on c6 is better, notice that that pawn on c6 is completely undefended. And if we did the other, the pawn would be on e6 and the king could move up and the rook could move over and defend it. Black might put up a little resistance, but So rook takes c6 is the best approach in this case. We're attacking the knight. The knight with a pawn, but our pawn is pinned. So obviously we want to break the pin with queen to g3. And the author has black make the worst move. Knight to g4. This is so easy. Queen takes knight, winning a piece, the pawn's pin. Illusory protection. It only looks like the pawn's protecting the knight. Well, it looks to me like white's attacking. You know the author so well. The white queen is attacking along the long diagonal. If that knight gets out of the way, the pawn on g7's pinning, allowing queen takes rook pawn check. White's turn. White just takes the pawn. The knight was protecting the pawn, but obviously he can't do knight takes rook. Checkmate. Somebody makes a blunder here because the positions don't look that bad, do they? So let's go right into it. Oh, white makes the horrible move. Who would care to solve the last problem for tonight? Go ahead, Ben.
Queen takes bishop.
Right. The pawn doesn't protect anything because it's pinned. So h3 is definitely the worst, or one of the worst moves on the board. That covers, we got through 2 topics tonight. That's great. Thanks.